Hi, everyone. Welcome. We will just give it a moment and let everybody get into the webinar. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're just going to give it a moment and let everybody get in. Okay, great. Let's get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us again today. My name is Shannon Gannam, and I'm the Global Education Director at Magnum Photos. And with my colleague, Pauline Vermeer, Cultural Director at Magnum Photos New York, we are your hosts for the Beyond Magnum series. Beyond Magnum is an in-depth talks program created to explore some of the challenges facing our agency and our industry today. Through this series of free talks in chapters addressing archives, representation, and the future of photography, speakers will share thoughts and engage in debates across a range of issues. Each section will be led by respected figures from the world of photography, and speakers will range from practitioners to academics to subjects of photographs. Recordings from Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 can be found on the Beyond Magnum page and on the Magnum Photos YouTube channel. And you can hear more from our president, Olivia Arthur, about the aims of the program in the first session. So some housekeeping before we kick off Chapter 3. Today's event is being hosted via Zoom webinar. Please put any questions you have for our speakers in the Q&A box, and we'll try and answer as many of these as we can. We recognize that this series of events will likely raise more questions than answer them, and that it's the beginning of a conversation. So thank you for your contributions to that dialogue. You'll be seeing more from us following this program about how we'll take that dialogue forward for us as an agency and as part of a wider industry. Please note, you may not have seen the time change. We've extended this session to 90 minutes. We realize we have a lot in this first chapter, and we wanted to give it enough time. And with that, I'll hand over to Pauline to introduce our co-chairs, Fred Ritchin and Zara Rasul. Thank you, Pauline.
Thank you, Shannon. Hello and welcome, everyone. We are deeply honored that Zahra Rasool and Fred Ritchin accepted our invitation to co-chair this third and final chapter of Beyond Magnum, and immensely grateful to you, Fred, for introducing us to Zara, with whom you have collaborated in the past, including on the Sundance presentation of Still Here, an immersive multimedia installation exploring issues surrounding incarceration, erasure, and gentrification. Your statement reads, "Given the many profound challenges that the world is facing, what might photography's role be in facilitating a more coherent discussion about the potentials for positive change and healing? And given the extensive transformation of media in the current digital post-truth age, what role can a photograph still be expected to play? Are we facing a renaissance in imagery or a dystopia?" It is my greatest pleasure to introduce you both to our audience today, and we're all very much looking forward to the many insightful talks that you have put together. So I'm going to be reading your bios, and then Fred, I will hand over to you. Fred Ritchin is Dean Emeritus of the International Center of Photography, ICP, school, serving more than 3,500 students annually in graduate, certificate, continuing education, and youth photography programs. Previously, Ritchin had founded the documentary photography and visual journalism program at the ICP school and directed it from 83 to 86. He was appointed Dean in 2014 and Dean Emeritus in 2017. Immediately prior to joining ICP, Fred Ritchin was Professor of Photography and Imaging at NYU Tisch School of the Arts from 1991 to 2014, where he co-directed the NYU Magnum Foundation Photography and Human Rights Educational Program. Ritchin has been picture editor of the New York Times Magazine between 1978 and 1982, and executive editor of Camera Art Magazine from 1982 to 1983. In 1999, he co-founded and directed Pixel Press, an online publication and a collaborator on human rights initiatives with organizations such as UNICEF, the World Health Organization, the Centers for Disease Control, Rotary International, Crimes of War, and UNFPA. Ritchin has written and lectured internationally about the challenges and possibilities of the digital media revolution. He has published 3 books on the future of images: In Our Own Image, The Coming Revolution in Photography in 1990, After Photography in 2008, and Bending the Frame, Photojournalism, Documentary and the Citizen in 2013. In 2016, he co-authored with Carole Nagard the Magnum photo book, The Catalogue Raisonné. He has also been curator of numerous exhibitions on subjects ranging from Latin American photography to alternative image strategies for social change. He created the first multimedia version of the New York Times in 94-95, and the website Bosnia Uncertain Path to Peace that Ritchin made with photographer Gilles Perez for the New York Times in 1996 was subsequently nominated by the Times for a Pulitzer Prize in public service. More recently, he created the Four Corners Project, an innovative open source strategy to provide more context and ethical grounding for the photograph online. In 2012, he was presented with the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Argentinian Documentary Photography Festival in Tucumán. And in 2017, he received the John Long Ethics Award from the National Press Photographers Association. In 2020, he helped to create the online publication photodemic.org, and at the end of that year, launched the fifthcorner.org, a resource for photographers. Thank you, Fred. Zahra Rasool is an Emmy-nominated producer, writer, and media entrepreneur whose journalism, storytelling, and innovation centers marginalized communities and people of color. Still Here, her most recent work about incarceration and gentrification in Harlem premiered at the 2020 Sundance Film Festival. Zahra's past experiences bear testament to her commitment to innovation and community-centered storytelling. In 2015, she founded G-Story, an interactive map and social platform to deliver news summaries to millennials globally. In 2016, she joins Riot as managing editor and later the Huffington Post to build one of the first companies to use immersive technologies for editorial storytelling. She was recognized as a global media game changer at the International Broadcasting Convention in 2018, nominated for the Robert G. McGruder Award for Diversity Leadership in 2019, and the American Express Next Gen Leadership Award in 2020. In May 2017, Zahra created and launched AJ Contrast, part of Al Jazeera Media Network, one of the largest, most diverse global operations broadcasting news to over 400 million households in more than 150 countries. Since 2017, Zahra and her team have been nominated for 31 Media and Film Awards and have won 15, including an NABJ Award, an RTDNA Award, 2 Online Journalism Award, OJA, 2 Webbies, and 1 Shorty, among others. Her documentaries have been screened at over 40 international film festivals, including at Sundance, Sheffield Doc Fest, and Berlinale. Outside of her homes in New York and Mumbai, Zahra has lived in Doha, London, and Cheonan in South Korea. It is my pleasure to introduce you both and to let you, Fred, start your presentation. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much, Pauline. I think we just wanted, Zahra and I, to let everybody know what's coming these 3 days. Today I'll be speaking in the morning, and then Zahra will be speaking in the afternoon on her practice. And day 2, we'll be starting with Thomas Dvorak and his work photographing Zoom meetings, weddings, and so on, as well as many Instagram books he's done. And then, Zahra, do you want to talk about the next panel?
And the next panel that I'll be moderating is going to be on the impact of social media, looking at images from Gaza on COVID and the climate crisis. We're really excited about the panel because we have from Gaza, we have one of the very few female photographers who works there. And then talking about the COVID crisis, we have a Pulitzer-nominated photographer, Joshua Irwandi, who's going to join us. And in the part 2 of the panel, we have 3 really cool climate activists ranging from 18 years to 23 years of age who are going to tell us how they're actually using videos, images, social platforms from Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok to raise awareness about the climate.
And then that afternoon, there's a 2-part panel, the real, the unreal, and the authentic. Josue Rivas will be talking about primarily portraiture from his indigenous traditions. Marvin Heiferman will be talking about the use of Instagram to build community as he grieves over the death of his husband, Marvin, who passed away last year. And the afternoon after that will be Alexei Urinev talking about using artificial intelligence to kind of reimagine the life of his grandfather fighting in the Russian military in World War II, and Debbie Cornwall talking from necessary fictions about state-sponsored illusions, manipulations, and how to deal with that imagistically. And day 3. In the morning, I'll be talking with Ellen Tolmie, who's been picture editor of UNICEF for many, many years, about the ethical perspective about photographing children, and then the future for photographic institutions from Aperture, from Magnum, and 2 prominent educators from working in The Hague and in Maryland. And Zara?
And then after that, we have a panel called Beyond Representation, Challenging Conventional Narratives. Here, the idea of the panel is to discuss where do we go after representation? How do we move the conversation forward beyond that? And I have 3 really lovely speakers that are joining us. Lisa Osborne, who's the director of Black Public Media in Harlem. Yasmin Alayat, she is an Emmy-winning documentary filmmaker. Her recent project was showing at Tribeca this year, and Nick Bruckman just did a documentary as well, filming Adi Barakan, the healthcare activist, and his documentary also premiered at Sundance last month. So they're all going to be here to have that conversation with us.
And that's it. So that's the introduction, and now I'll start talking. We do have the chat set up as well as questions and answers. Feel free to participate whenever you'd like. And I will now.
Yeah, I'm going to be moderating the talk and making sure all of the questions that you guys have are asked to Fred. So please feel free throughout the conversation to drop in your questions. Don't hesitate. You don't have to wait until the very end. If there are questions that are related to what Fred is currently talking about, I can stop him, ask him your question before he moves ahead with his presentation. So please continue sending your questions in the chat box.
So I assume everybody sees the screen. Yes.
Looks good.
Yeah, it's a little bit like Hamlet's soliloquy when you talk and don't see the people, to be or not to be. So we will do our best. So I'm talking about the paradigm shift, photography transformed. Traditionally, we've thought of photography as a way of confirming, proving existence. Bernard Kouchner is one of the founders of Doctors Without Borders, said, without a photograph, we've never been able to prove that a massacre ever happened. Nobody would believe the eyewitness because it was considered subjective when a person said it, but the photograph had greater weight. Marshall McLuhan, the great media theorist, starts one of his chapters talking about meeting a woman who had a baby in the carriage, and he said, "Oh, that's a good-looking baby." And she said, "Yeah, but wait till you see his photograph." It's the photograph that would confirm existence, that would give us a sense of what's happening far away, that would be an eyewitness to events. And that's its traditional role in the 20th century. But what I'm showing you here is not a photograph. In fact, it's from the website, "This person does not exist." So at this point, we're seeing, because of artificial intelligence, the use of neural networks, we're seeing an explosion of the use of synthetic imagery, artificial imagery, to simulate the photograph, to the point where it may be very, very difficult, first of all, to tell what is a photograph and what is not, but also it begins to question what is the role of photography in the 21st century. It used to be that the photograph, as I said, was a witness, but now we find that so many photographs are no longer a recording of the visible because of the software and cameras, the use of filters, the use of software programs like Photoshop, and so on and so on. There's very little expectation that a photograph of the 21st century is necessarily a recording of the visible. So in the line with the James Baldwin quote, "The purpose of art is to lay bare the questions that are hidden by the answers," we often use photography to give answers. And I think what needs to be done is for us to begin questioning, what is a photograph? What can it do differently at this point? What can it no longer do? The photograph of the 21st century, is it even the right term to use? Or are we just looking in the rear view mirror? So for example, these images as well, none of these are actual people. One of the issues to me becomes that these things are so easy to create or so easy to adopt that in many ways they will begin to replace the photograph as kind of idealized versions of what we might think about ourselves in the future or even the very near future. There's a website coming out of Argentina, generated photos, and as of this week, they're offering 2,685,000 free generated photos. None of these people exist. On the left side of this, you can choose the head pose, sex, age, ethnicity, and even the emotion of whatever it is you want. So these are beautified, left-facing young Black people. This is a natural, young, white, blonde-haired, long-haired, joyous female with blue eyes. And here a beautified, infant, joyful person. None of these people exist. And what they're doing with this is they're arguing that you should be able to represent yourself with generated photos that will remind you of yourself, but not be yourself, so that your online presence becomes an avatar. One of the issues there is that you can actually disguise yourself. You could become, quote unquote, a better version of yourself. You could become more attractive to people. You could become less recognizable on the street by surveillance cameras. There's various ideas behind this. And you could use your new face anywhere without having to worry about likeness rights. So obviously it's not just your new face. You could use any of these new faces anywhere without worrying about likeness rights, paying a subject, being sued by a subject, privacy issues, and so on and so forth. So they advertise this as worry-free model photos, and it's being used by all these different industries. I've seen advertisements where they say, make your organization, I don't remember which website, but make your organization look diverse. Take some of our synthetic images and stick them in. It's a lot easier than hiring people. So that this is the kind of thinking behind this. Obviously, for artificial intelligence, this is a relatively simple set of issues to simulate photography, but it's one that's happening now. With child pornography, I find it particularly troubling. Laws have been traditionally made to protect actual children, but if they're synthetic, if they don't exist, one can see, again, an enormous use of synthetic imagery of all kinds of people, animals, imaginary creatures in all kinds of ways, including pornography, which is something that is hardly being dealt with at this time in terms of ethical issues, legal issues, and societal issues. But one of the things that makes me think when I look at this is the fact that they could simulate photographs at this point. what do photographs actually do that are different than synthetic images? You know, these are just covers of magazines. To me, these people look fairly synthetic, even though they're supposed to be actual people. They don't seem to have very much personality, much depth, much complexity. They're commercialized, objectified. So that when you bring in an actual synthetic image, I feel relieved. This person seems to have more personality than the actual people, the synthetic person. This is from the Image Atlas, a fantastic website where you see, by putting in a search term, what people see in various countries when they look it up. I put in beauty, so you see in Afghanistan, Brazil, Egypt, France, Germany, India, beauty. There's, you know, when you put in beauty, there's obviously no men. It tends to be white women, young women. It's a rather restricted definition of what beauty is, you know, across different countries. And again, when you bring in a synthetic image, to me, it's in some sense preferable to the objectification that is widespread in photography at this point. You know, one of the issues for me, for example, is we use the word selfie as almost a synonym for self-portrait. To me, a selfie is really a sharing of experience. It's not a self-portrait. It's more a form of branding than a form of introspection. So again, in terms of vocabulary, we have to start asking, are we talking about something that doesn't exist anymore? Something that, or could be reinvented. So one of the issues is, the way I see it, that it's not an accident that we reconceived ourselves as coming from DNA. At the same time, we invented digital media. They're both code-based. They're based on code. So that the 20th century was phenotype, about appearances, photography, what things looked like. And I think a lot of these algorithms that we're seeing, including the ones I just showed you in synthetic imagery, take cognizance of the idea that we're moving into more of an interest in code. You know, that people, some magazine recently published the kind of ancestry code of its staff, as opposed to the way people look. We're moving more into underlying biological processes, you know, different processes that are not just determined, that are not just about appearance. So that's one massive change. So all this synthetic imagery is called deepfakes when it's used in video, and it creates then also alternative facts, a possibility of synthesizing things that never happened, like this.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, I don't know, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place, or how about this, simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit. Now, you see, I would never say these things, at least not in a public address, but someone else would. Someone like Jordan Peele.
So what you're doing is you're seeing, there's now a sound version where you could hear the speech that John F. Kennedy, the President of the United States, was supposed to give in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, the day he was assassinated. It sounds just like him. People are using this on different world leaders. There's actually apps where you could put different people's face in and have them say whatever you want them to say. You know, your third grade teacher, your friends, yourself, anybody. So again, this opens up the idea that the lens-based media, photography and video, one could no longer assume that what you're seeing is actually a record of the way it looked like. So here I see it as the analog media of the 20th century, where a continuous media, continuous tone. We're really based upon a Newtonian idea of cause and effect, conceptually, and digital media, which are discrete pixels, zeros and ones, resemble much more the quantum idea of discrete packets of energy. And in the quantum universe, there's probabilities. It's not certainties. There are alternative facts, there are alternative possibilities. And I think that some of what we're seeing in digital media generally is a movement away from that kind of certitude of the 20th century. If you photograph a girl being bombed by napalm in Vietnam in 1972, that's what was happening, to now a sense like of possibilities. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't happen. It depends who interprets it. It depends how it's captioned. It depends if it's a red state or a blue state. It depends on a lot of different things at this point. Photography becomes much more ambiguous, which in some ways is also very positive. So in our field of photography, to me, it started in 1982, this idea. National Geographic took a horizontal photograph of two pyramids of Giza next to each other, rotated the pyramid on the left, behind the one on the right. And when I interviewed, and 2 years later, the editor-in-chief of National Geographic, why did you do this? He said, it's really nothing. All we did was go back in time and move the photographer a few feet to one side to get a different point of view. So this is already 40 years ago, just about, that we were already able to go back in time and get a different point of view by moving the photographer. There's a malleability to photography. It's not a certitude. It's not just what the lens saw at that moment. This was the first future news photograph. Tonya Harding and Nancy Kerrigan, two ice skaters who were having a feud. We're going to meet tomorrow on the ice. Newsday said, there they are, to meet at practice, as if there they were, a future photograph. Or this one, which was published in 8 Finnish newspapers of a Swedish airplane crash. There was no photographer present and no camera. And the way they did it was by asking eyewitnesses and compositing it, calling it a news photograph. And this was already happening about 25 years ago. So at an essential level, photography no longer can be considered a recording or a quotation from appearances. That's what John Berger called it, a quotation from appearances. We know that in words, if you quote somebody, you cannot change the words once it's inside quotation marks. I find that's a very useful definition. And in a documentary sense, it might be something to think about. We want to think of the frames of the photograph as quote marks, quotation marks, so that anything within it should not be changed except the equivalent, as in words. If somebody goes like that, you could take it out. If there's dust spots, if there's a little, an issue of contrast, maybe there's parameters that we could work with, but maybe we have to rethink the photograph of the 20th century, bringing it into the 21st, if we still wanted to have a witnessing function as a quotation. So that when the New York Times last year published the first 100,000 people who died of COVID in the United States, I was very much struck by how they did not use photographs. I was interested, typically you show the faces. There were, production reasons, other reasons as well, but they abandoned the use of photography. And then I saw this site sent to me by a former student. At the same time, the 100 faces, Matt Karastov did it, which is now 535,000 faces. And as you go through it, you realize these are all synthetic images. None of these people existed. But what he did was demographically, he tried to match the number of synthetic images of older people, younger people, people of color, not of color, and so on, demographically correct, even though none of these people existed. And what he said is he hopes visitors can better understand the COVID crisis and better express their grief. I know it has done so for me. So the idea now is that you're mourning synthetic imagery. It's a different thing than we would have done, for example, during the Vietnam War, when Life magazine famously published around 240 photographs of American soldiers who died that week. Those were the actual identity photographs that we grieve. Now we're grieving synthetic imagery. And in art as well, it's very much happening all over the place. This is an image that was supposed to sell by Christie's at auction for $7,000 to $10,000. It was made by an algorithm. by obvious. It's, I think, three guys in France who are more or less 25 years old. They borrowed, it seems they borrowed somebody else's open source algorithm and used it and did it, and it sold for something around $430,000. So we're seeing that more and more in music. We're seeing it in painting. I'm sure we're going to see it more and more, you know, the Cartier-Bresson decisive moment algorithm and so on, coming out of algorithms, you know, coming out of the non-human. You know, Alexei, when he speaks on Tuesday, will be talking about his use of these kinds of algorithms for a documentary purpose with World War II and his grandfather who fought in the Russian army. But these are issues, and one of the issues then is, you know, what does a human add that as an algorithm doesn't to a painting, to music, and so on. So when Paul Delaroche, when painting when photography was invented in 1839, he said in 1840, the year after, from today, painting is dead because photography took over the representational strategies of painting. It was cheaper, it was more detailed, it was more a better reproduction, and he thought painting had died. And to me, the hopeful part of all this, or one of them, is that painting, in fact, did the opposite of die. Painting became really interesting. You know, Impressionism, Cubism, Abstract Expressionism, Minimalism. It was not stuck on representation anymore. So one of the questions for photography is, do these synthetic images then liberate it to do something different than concentrate on representation? Are there other avenues to pursue, just as there were for painting? And we saw that also in the 1920s and 30s, when the small camera, the Leica, the 35 millimeter camera, the film, the faster film, more light sensitive came out. At the same time, not surprisingly, we got picture magazines coming out. 1928, Vue in France, you know, which was an extraordinary magazine, in my opinion, better than any mass magazine, picture magazine that exists today. It used photography in much more interesting ways. 8 years later, we got Life magazine in the United States coming out. This was the first issue of Life. And interestingly, Vue, as its manifesto, thought of itself as animated like a fine film, concerned with this, depicting this speeded up rhythm of everyday life. So it was about the rhythm of life that Vue magazine was seeing, you know, with the industrial era, the modern era, life speeded up. On the other hand, Life magazine, its manifesto was very different. To see life, to see the world, to eyewitness great events, to watch the faces of the poor and the gestures of the proud, to see strange things. In my opinion, Life, if you translate it into language, into text, Life was interested in nouns and adjectives. And Vue magazine was interested in verbs and adverbs. And as a result, you started to see photography that was very different. In France, Cartier-Bresson, the decisive moment, you know, which he defined as the simultaneous recognition in a fraction of a second of the significance of an event, as well as of a precise organization of forms, which gave that event its proper expression. So it was interested in time. It was interested in time as fleeting, as passing, as the fraction of second. On the other hand, you had Robert Capa. These two, not coincidentally, were two of the four founders of Magnum Photos. And Robert Capa was said, you know, famously, if your pictures aren't good enough, you aren't close enough. It wasn't about the passing of time. It was about physical proximity. It was about being close to it emotionally and physically. It was a very, very different take on it. You know, my argument has been that every culture has thought of photography differently. Latin American photography, I've argued, you know, like Melquiades in Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude, in a fraction of a second in the novel, he sees 100 years. So that's very different than Cartier-Bresson in a fraction of a second, seeing a fraction of a second. In one, time is expansive. In one, there's a celebration of the passing of time, of its fractionalization. So that I've never thought of photography as a universal language. We've been lazy and we've thought it that way, but it's not. When it's made in different cultures, it means different things. It's read different ways, both by cultures and by individuals. So Cartier-Bresson, when he was taking advantage of these early fast cameras, small cameras, he was offered to photograph the coronation of King George VI, to have an exclusive in London, the new king, and he refused it. And instead he took something like the equivalent of $5 from an afternoon communist newspaper in Paris to photograph the people watching, because it was the ripples that were more interesting than the main event itself. These three images are considered among his strongest images. So, you know, it's kind of like you throw a rock, it hits the water in the pond, and a lot of people photograph the rock. He was interested in the ripples. When I asked him, when I interviewed him, he recommended to me 4 books to read. One was Zen and the Art of Archery. How do you hit the target without aiming? You know, how do you do things differently? Photography is complicated. It's always been complicated. And one of the problems now is we've made it homogenized. And, you know, a possibility is to go back in time and look at what some other people did. When Cartier-Bresson, for example, was photographing Mahatma Gandhi in India, the two of them sat and looked at a book of Cartier-Bresson's photographs. He bicycled away, and then he heard that Gandhi was assassinated. He went back and he photographed on his bicycle. He went back and he photographed from outside at the window, out of respect. He wouldn't go in. Margaret Bourke-White, the American photographer, went in with a larger camera, a flash, almost on top of the body, and she had her film ripped out by the colleagues of Mahatma Gandhi for being so aggressive. Life magazine at that point had no photographs of this and asked Magnum, Cartier-Bresson, for his photographs, because later they did invite him in because he was respectful. He was invited in to photograph. Magnum refused out of respect. And they said, we'll never work with any photographer in Magnum again if you don't give the photographs. They eventually did give the photographs. But it was a very, very different way of looking at things, you know, a different kind of sense of respect and not wanting to intrude with photography. You know, we have terms in photography to shoot a photograph, to freeze, to capture, to take a photograph. And, you know, these do not do well in terms of deconstructing the photograph as something other than an aggressive act. You know, we could say, I'm making a photograph, I'm collaborating with my subject. There's other ways of talking about it, which we might want to think about as well. So this is from Cartier-Bresson, 1957. Life isn't made of stories that you cut into slices like an apple pie. There's no standard way of approaching a story. We hope to have to evoke a situation, a truth. This is the poetry of life's reality. So again, from the very beginning, from, you know, the 20th century, there were many, many ways of thinking about making photographs. You know, he contrasted this to kind of be the accountant who just records every detail. He's trying to get at some essence. You know, it's like the Eugene Smith book, Let Truth Be the Prejudice. We're trying to get at a deeper truth. We're just not stenographers. And then Robert Capa in the 1930s, photographing the Spanish Civil War, you know, Death in the Making, his famous book, which has photographs by Shim, David Seymour, another founder, and Gerda Taro, and was designed by Andre Kertész. This was an anti-fascist book. This was not an objective book, a kind of conventional journalism. This was somebody whose heart was bleeding against fascism. And so there's also a tradition of doing stuff out of a kind of a passion. When I asked Cartier-Bresson, why did you found Magnum in 1947, when I interviewed him several times, and he said, in part, it was because we wanted to help make the world a better place, because World War II had just finished. You know, the world was almost destroyed, and we thought as photographers we could be useful. Or George Roger, the fourth founder from England, he was one of the first people into the concentration camps in Bergen-Belsen, the picture on the left. And after making this picture, he said, I can no longer frame these atrocities, put it in a nice frame. It was just too much for him. He'd photographed in over 60 countries in World War II, and he gave up war photography. He went to Africa to photograph for quite a long time, where he felt the world was less corrupt than what had happened in Europe. You know, David Seymour in after World War II, Children of Europe, working for UNESCO, which had just been founded. You know, he's considered, if not the first, but one of the first human rights photographers. You know, there's 13 million child refugees, and he was trying to be helpful, to use these photographs as a way of getting them aid, of support. It wasn't simply documenting, you know, testimony, witnessing, but it was a kind of an activism, an engagement, trying to push it further. And again, then it asks us in the 21st century, you know, how can we do these sorts of things? So this is going back, continuing with Magnum American Crisis, 1968, a group project, very similar to what we've been going through in the United States and many countries. How do we put all this different work together to raise consciousness? You know, how would we do it today with the red states and blue states in the United States, having come through this Trump era? You know, there was a slot machine. There was a fun element. If you got all three images together, the Nixon money mask, you won, whatever winning means. Or Abigail Heyman in 1974, you know, who was in Magnum, at that time, one of the very few female members of Magnum, growing up female, a personal photojournal. This is Abby. This is Abby photographing her own abortion. You know, there was a text, a diary, a sense of possibility. To me, this is one of the really important works, much too little known, on the emergence of feminism in the 1970s. Or Jim Goldberg's book, Rich and Poor, you know, where he photographed wealthy people and poor people in San Francisco and asked them to write on the photograph what they thought of the photograph, to be interactive, to respond, to help contextualize it, to collaborate. We look like ordinary people. We have a terrible life. Or on the right, Edgar looks splendid here. His power and strength of character come through. He's a very private person who's not demonstrative of his affection. His wife writes, on the top, Edgar writes, my wife is acceptable. Our relationship is satisfactory. To me, this is one of the great image text combinations I've ever seen in terms of revealing underlying strata of emotions and relationships in this Rich and Poor. Or Raymond Depardon, working Correspondance New-Yorkaise, 1982. Again, we're talking 40 years ago, where he combined first person and third person journalism, photojournalism. When I asked Cartier-Bresson to define photojournalism, he said it's keeping a journal with a camera, a diary, and that's what Raymond did for Libération. So every day he'd send back to France from New York one picture with his own caption that they publish on the Foreign Affairs page. Christian Cajol was the photo editor. It rains, it's the Independence Day, it's a holiday, the city's empty. You know, I take a visit to the Statue of Liberty, I discuss all night with a girlfriend, I want to go back to France to let everything go. I force myself to make a photo. I ask myself, what am I doing here? Everything's sad. It's a bad day. I start to read the novel G by John Berger. That's a very different way of doing foreign affairs. Or in Harlem, where he went with Dith Pran, the Cambodian photographer from the New York Times. In those days, Harlem was very much depicted as a place of violence and drugs. He showed it in a very different way in 1982 on another day. Or Wall Street. It's a gold mine for a photographer. Here, there are no vacations, he writes. He turns the photojournalism into both about what's out there and what's in here, and there's an authenticity to revealing who he is and what he feels, not just what the camera says. Or Gilles Perez, working in Iran when Khomeini came to power, I published this in the New York Times Magazine, and we called it a vision of Iran. It's the first time I'm aware of that the New York Times Magazine ever allowed a headline like that. It wasn't Iran, what's happening, the Islamic Revolution. It's a vision of Iran, that photographers are allowed to have visions, interpretations, that they're not just, again, stenographers, reporters, but they could go deeper into things there. Or Antoine Dagata using a thermal camera at the time of COVID to say something different, or Thomas Dvorak, who I'll be speaking with tomorrow morning, or New York Times tomorrow morning, who's done Instagram books, collecting photographs from Instagram, just the way when he was in Afghanistan and he found a portrait studio where Taliban had posed for portraits. He did a book of that. And these Instagram books include one about, for example, going to Auschwitz, which becomes a kind of a picnic for some people, a school trip. And you see things that the official media don't show you. This enormous billions and billions of imagery on social media that we barely ever consult or curate. Or Yael Martinez from Guerrero in Mexico, the House That Bleeds, who won the Eugene Smith Award recently for this work about his family and the disappearance of members of his family. And he did it impressionistically and from an interiority, photographing dreams as opposed to the outside world, his daughter's dream. So he's able to both photograph the outside reality and the internal realities too. So here we're seeing that photography is being liberated, just as painting was liberated. It's doing different things. It has been doing different things, and it needs to be doing more different things. And Vietnam Inc. from Philip Jones Griffiths, 1971, which is one extraordinary book in terms of his 2.5 years of work in Vietnam, of him looking at the systems underneath these symptoms. Photography is often the low-hanging fruit. It's the symptoms, what's visible. But he's trying to look at the systems underneath all of this. What's actually going on? Why are pacification objectives means actually destroying villages? It's Orwellian, war is peace, peace is war. Or this image, it's a World War II type image, where the caption reads, US combat troops arrive outnumbering the enemy 3-1 and possessing the most sophisticated military hardware. The job seemed easy. Earlier spirits were high among the troops, intoxicated as much by the spectacle of their own strength as by the cold beer delivered to them daily. I showed this once at New York University, and a friend of mine was in the audience who'd served in Vietnam, and he said the beer was warm. But the idea of undercutting your own images, of showing how little girls are raised to become sex workers because of the American presence, selling first girly pictures. These kinds of pictures of American soldiers were not the heroic mythic, going beyond it, showing how economies, infrastructures are being built to serve this kind of military effort. Or Vietnam Inc., which was actually a corporate takeover even more than a military effort. Or how the car salesman would try to sell cars to the people in the field, the soldiers in the field, so that when they came home, a car would be waiting for them. These are images that you do not see from war, which tends to stereotype, a kind of mythic warrior idea all too often. Or how he combined the people 35,000 feet in the air dropping napalm with their victims. He's one of the few people to do that, to use montage, to connect imagery, to connect ideas together. So now I'll just show you a few other people's work. Again, I'm talking about the issue of Renaissance. To me, this is a period of Renaissance. In some ways, you could argue both Photoshop and synthetic imagery have liberated photography to do things differently. This is Anton Kuster's Blue Skies project, where he photographed 1,078 blue skies over former concentration camps from World War II. It's I think a 5.5-year project. And what he did was, in it, he made 3 Polaroids over every blue sky. And when you hear the tone in the background, what you're hearing is an Excel sheet that plays a beep at different pitches, depending which concentration camp it was, where the different people died. So every time you hear a beep, that means from 1933 to 1945, it runs for those 13 years. You hear a beep every time somebody died, and the Wiesel quote, "Never shall I forget the little faces of the children whose bodies I saw turned into wreaths of smoke beneath a silent blue sky." The idea that we've seen the victimization, and now he's asking us to imagine it, just as we can imagine blue skies over refugees from Syria caught in boats in the middle of the water. We could imagine Uyghurs being persecuted by the Chinese government. The blue skies are over all of us. And a Swiss publication ran all 1,078 blue skies. It's now going to be shown at Arles in July. Or this, a project I worked on with the Daylight Foundation, where they gave a camera, 10 cameras, disposable, to be distributed in Iraq a year after the US invasion. We did it in Arabic and English. And so this became not the Iraqi people as crazy people killing each other, but people just like us. CNN ran this for about 7 minutes, these pictures. And CNN ran it in part because they didn't have the idea. It may have been too dangerous. Maybe they didn't have people who spoke Arabic. But the idea of giving the power of self-representation, to me, this became my most important photograph of the Iraqi war. They go to the dentist just like we do. They're not the other. Stop othering. We're all people. And this, is a project we did in Pixel Press, Robert Knapp, Anton de Jong, of people with radiation sickness because of above ground testing and accidents in Eastern Europe. And here we hid the captions so that you had to actually hover over it, roll over it to see what was going on. To me, it's like the ambiguity of the photograph is amazing. You have to imagine it. And then you roll over to find out what's going on, what actually happened there. It's kind of like a quantum collapse where it's a wave particle duality. There's an ambiguity. You don't know if it's a wave or particle until you observe it, and then it collapses it. Too often we use captions to collapse an image, so the image is just easy to read. We wanted to make it harder to read. Or this project done for Amnesty International, the last meals of prisoners who were then executed was then shown, used by Amnesty to show that quite a number of these people were executed and later found to be innocent. Those were their last meals, and this 13 years later, they found that he was innocent. So there are several photographers who've done this kind of work, the last meals, recreating the last meals, the people, a more conceptual take on it, but it's effective in terms of making us understand that the death penalty is probably a terrible thing to use. Or a proactive photography, what I call a peace photography. This is Gideon Mendel here. So there's a feeling by Western governments and NGOs that they didn't want to fund antiretroviral drugs in Africa. They had a very racist idea that Africans would not be disciplined enough to take the medicine. It would be a waste of money. Gideon, who's originally from South Africa, went back to South Africa over 4 years and showed a pilot program where somebody did take the medicines. And after 4 years, they were able to work, take care of their family. And I asked UNAIDS the impact, and they said 8 million people are in treatment today, in part because of these photographs. So it's proactive. It's not using photography to wait for the disaster and win a World Press Photo Award, but it's using photography to try so that the disaster does not happen. Magnum did a similar project later on antiretroviral drugs and their impact in different countries. And the Global Fund, with whom they collaborated, said that as a result, they raised $1 billion for medicines for people who are HIV positive. In fact, the Japanese foreign minister is said to have gone to the show in Tokyo for 45 minutes and raised their contribution from $200 million to $400 million because of the the exhibition. So these are some of the people who'll be speaking this week. Alexei on the artificial intelligence, Debbie on state-sponsored illusions, Marvin on the loss of his husband, Maurice Berger, on working with Instagram, Josue Rivas, interactive portraiture. And in conclusion, I just want to spend about 5 minutes just showing you some other ideas that people are using as well. One of the things I teach is interactive portraiture. The digital revolution makes it possible for people to show the picture they made of somebody and ask them what they think of it. Is this you? Does this represent you? And then record their voice.
Do you think that photo represents you?
No, because I'm a smiling person. I actually like to be smiling, you know. I do that just about most of the day.
So if you're not smiling, it's not you.
Huh?
So if you're not smiling, it's not you.
Yes, it's me, but I mean, that picture, I mean, definitely, I don't think it really tells me, because it more look like I'm sad or something like that.
Do you think this is a photo that depicts you? That says who you are?
No,
Why not?
because I don't think any picture ever will.
Or this one is from a student from Indonesia.
Soalnya pas santai aja itu kelihatan orang santai.
Then he asked him to choose she asked him to choose which photograph he would choose to represent himself. I chose this one because it was a laid-back photograph. It does not look like someone who's occupied with work or busy doing things. I'm just resting. And so that was his choice. We also do things with rollovers so that you know, an assignment photograph, make a portrait of somebody without showing their face so that they could be identified, which is a usual portraiture, and then allow the reader to roll over to see more. So this is by Jean Bizimana from Rwanda, or this one from Ranita Roy from India. So the idea being that there's not one way to see somebody. It's almost cubist. It's again, going back to painting, it's the idea that photography can be multivocal, multi-perspectives. It doesn't have to just be so straight on. Or this was an interactive self-portrait. Ashwara was living in Texas with her husband. And then even today's New York Times, just to say, you know, much of what I'm showing seems marginal. In my opinion, it is becoming the mainstream. The mainstream is transforming. So the New York Times just today had their photographer, Adam Ferguson, set up self-portraits for people in Mexico who want to migrate to the United States, and then their interviews with them so that they're able to show themselves. They're not being depicted by the outsider. You know, there's much criticism of photography, the white male gaze and so on and so forth, the interactive portrait, the double portrait, the interactive self-portrait. You know, these images I'm showing you now, they open up other possibilities that people have more autonomy in terms of self-representation, which we'll be talking a lot during this week. And then just a couple of things finally, going back to the idea of the universal language. I was in Cuba in 1984. Marucha here was a friend. She was a wonderful photo historian and photographer. I was writing a criticism, a critique of a show of Cuban photography. And I wrote about this image that she made as a kind of Marilyn Monroe image. You know, the young woman, her quinceañera, her sweet 15, emerging, rising above the others. You know, she's reaching womanhood. It's amazing. And Marucha told me I read the image completely wrong. She said, this is a socialist country. And the other people are criticizing her for trying to be above them. They're not celebrating her, they're criticizing her for doing it. And I was able to add that to my review before it went to print. Also, just a final thoughts as well, that photography is rectangles. Rectangle, rectangle, rectangle. It's always rectangles. Right now on Zoom, we were looking at each other in rectangles. Photography didn't start that way. There's something much more holistic about the oval, about the circle, you know, about a pinhole camera. that allows you to see in different ways. So one idea is also, why are we so stuck on the rectangle? Why can't we think of this other ways if we're trying to be, more healing? And I know Josue Rivas will be speaking about this tomorrow, coming from his tradition. If we want to use, for example, portraiture to heal, we could change shapes. That's not that difficult. And then the last thing is the Four Corners Project. It's something I suggested in 2004 when I gave the keynote speech to the World Press. It's a project to increase authorship and credibility in visual media. The idea being that if it's online, you can have rollovers in each of the corners of the image, the photograph, and you could hide different information. You could contextualize your own image. On the bottom right for authorship, you could, you'd write your name, you could click on your name, you could get your code of ethics, which I wrote. This is in fair use. While all photography is interpretive, as a photojournalist, my photographs are meant to respect the visible facts of the situation I depict. I do not add or subtract elements to or from my photographs. I wrote these codes of ethics just as a demonstration. You could give the backstory, what it felt like to be there, introduce the reader into some of the context, and you could have related imagery. So this is Alan Kurdi and his brother. To me, this is, otherwise it's generic, the image. But with this, he has a life. You can identify, you could empathize in different ways. Why not? And then the links, you could link to other websites. Here it's Human Rights Watch, the ethics of showing an image of a child who's 3 years old, who died trying to escape Syria. So these are codes of ethics. You could write your own. The website is there. It's open source. Anybody could use it. It's free. This is an Alex Webb. This is the US invasion of Haiti in '94. Related imagery. This is the Alex Webb photograph, what it looked like from behind. I remember showing this at World Press in 1994. Two of the photographers there got very angry at me for showing the illusion. But why not? Why can't we just show what's actually going on? Undermine the photo opportunities, whatever it would be, or have fun with it. Antoine Griezmann scoring a goal. Well, what actually happened? Well, you could actually see it now. You could see before, you could contextualize it. Or if they gun me down, it is a hashtag in the United States. A lot of times a young African-American men and women gunned down by the police. They use in the media the so-called gangster image, but you could use the related image, the graduation. Don't let them get away with it. Fight back, resist, show it a different way, do it differently, like that. This is how it works. It's all fourcornersproject.org. You could go there and find it. We did it, I think, 8 different languages: Japanese, Russian, Chinese, and Spanish, English, French, and so on. And I must say that most of the people using it are young people. Publications are afraid to use it at this point. They don't want to give context. They don't want to give the backstory, in my experience. There's a kind of authority that doesn't want to be questioned. But maybe that too will change over time as we move forward. So the last images now, this is where we come from, the 20th century. The photographs had enormous power in society. We focused on them. They were the front page. We don't have a front page for the most part anymore. We're looking on cell phones. Images are minuscule. You could click it away in a fraction of a second. I would not run the picture on the bottom left on an Instagram today. It's disrespectful. Here on a front page, there's something different going on, or the picture of the assassin, the execution. There's something different. You have to slow people down. It can't be speed, speed, speed all the time like fast food. It has to be ways we have to devise of slowing people down, going against the grain of the speeded up rhythm of society that Vue magazine talked about in 1928. This is Columbine students. I wrote a piece for Time magazine. They put a sticker on their cell phones and identity cards that if they're killed, these are high school students, if they're killed in a gun massacre in their high school, they want photographers to show their bodies. They want their death to be useful in society to help stop gun violence. So they believe in photographs. They believe, and they talk about how, photographers from the past have influenced them in terms of changing society. So again, it's something that we have to think about. How in this field can we be most effective in providing evidence, witnessing in the world for those people without power, those people who need to be supported as well as everybody else. And also, the fact that the most important video of this past year, without a doubt, is a video of the execution of George Floyd, done by a teenager, which is something we'll also be talking about this week. Zara's moderating about teenagers using social media and providing invaluable witnessing functions, because there's so many more people who are not professional photographers in proximity to different events. So, I think it's a happy circumstance that the Pulitzer Committee gave a special citation to the young woman who made this video this year, an amateur, not always having to be a professional, because those billions and trillions of images and videos, we certainly have to find more use for moving forward. So that's the talk. I'm sorry if it was long, but I thought there was a lot to get in, and now we're happy to discuss, take questions, and so on and so forth.
Sorry, off my air conditioner just to make sure we don't have the disturbance in the background. Thank you so much, Fred, for that wonderful presentation. It was so in-depth and really great. We do have a few questions that have come in from the audience, so I'm going to use that as a starting point to ask you some of the other questions that I have for you. So before we go into synthetic imaging, Photoshop and things like that, I wanted to ask you about your use of the word subject. And I know that's something we've spoken about. You brought it up a couple of times, and I just wanted to know, how do you feel about the word, and is there a better way to refer to people that we're collaborating with?
Yeah, I mean, there's in the photographic community, when I show interactive portraits in the past, some professionals have told me I'm taking away their power. They're the ones who should decide who somebody is in the image. Now, to me, that's problematic sometimes, because sometimes you just meet somebody for 5 minutes, 3 minutes, or sometimes you're in a foreign country or a foreign culture that you don't understand, so that you then make images that help to define somebody without their participation. We did a panel at Photodemic on photographing during the demonstrations around Black Lives Matter, and we talked about how photographers should not be predatory. They should not, take advantage. They should not be looking for spectacle, for violence, concentrating those ways, but they should be, as Bayate Ross Smith put it, they should be generous. They should be empathetic. They should be, collaborating with the subject, asking them who they are, what they're about, at times, showing them the image and saying, that does this represent you? And if not, why not? So, I think subject is an outmoded term. It's an older term, and it has connotations of objectification, distancing, othering, and so on. Using the word collaborator in some countries also has a bad connotation, like in France over World War II. If you're a collaborator, that wasn't necessarily a good thing in terms of the Nazi government. But no, we do have to look for different terms and different ways of thinking about it. And I think we will be talking about that during the week, with different of the participants as well.
Is there a term that you have felt is better evolved to use in our current times? And this is also a question for the audience. So if you guys have any suggestions of terms that you think are better, and why, please drop them in there so we can discuss them in the discussion.
I'm going to go around the block in answering this a little bit. I refer to, like Barton Buber, this idea of I, thou, I, it. We're all defined by relationship. And I, it is, you objectify somebody. You just say, there's a young, 33-year-old attractive woman who comes from Italy.
Mm-hmm.
It's objectifying. I, thou becomes a relationship he talks about with somebody you love, with God, which is all encompassing, that they're not definable by any kind of parameter. That's what captions often do. They kind of force the picture into an objectification. The photograph itself may be ambiguous. It may say a lot of different things, but the caption wants certitude out of it. So I think part of the issue isn't just making the photograph, but it's how do we contextualize it? What do we say about it? How much ambiguity do we leave? What is our responsibility to the reader to define? And one of the issues that comes up for me a lot is we've thought about photography as providing answers, but I think it like going back to the James Baldwin quote I started with, it's just as important and sometimes more important that the photograph asks really good questions. I'm here, I don't know what's going on really, but I'll share with you what I'm experiencing, what I'm seeing, what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, like that. So, I think all these things are part of it. And so I'm not sure there's a single term to replace subject, but I think there's different ways of wording it in different situations. If you're photographing Donald Trump as president of the United States, you may have a different relationship than if you're photographing an Indonesian laborer, for example. It may not always be the same word in all circumstances.
And I really like, you talking about photography's goal sometimes is, and a lot of times is not necessarily to provide the answers, but to ask the questions or to bring to your mind certain questions that you can think about. Sort of reminds me of the role of like public intellectuals have in this space. Their idea is not to provide the solutions, to critique and to question what's happening around us, and then for us collectively to find answers to those questions. Do you see that as a parallel in that sense, the role of photography?
No, very much so, but I think it's also moving away from the mechanical age. Where if you carry a camera, therefore, the mythology that the camera never lies. Well, the camera always lies. We know it always lies. It's mechanical. People are going to interpret it different ways. It leaves out certain things. It deals with one fraction of a second, but not another. That's really just a myth there. So we have to go beyond it. Cartier-Bresson talked about in a decisive moment that these photographs were taken by a random camera. Well, that's kind of a joke. I mean, obviously he made them. It's like the painter, if the paintbrush doesn't make the painting. The photographer makes the image, is responsible for the image, authors the image. It's not just a provider of images, but the author of images. You're responsible for what you're saying and the way you say it. So, I think there's then a scope for, saying, here's 12 images I made of a demonstration. I know what's happening in certain ones, other ones I'm not sure. Collaborate with the reader. What's happening? Maybe you were there, maybe maybe it's crowdsourcing, maybe it's just imagining, like the blue skies. What do you imagine happened there? And by imagining what happened there, you participate, you engage. It's Roland Barthes' idea of the active reader. The reader who engages. The text is not defined by the writer. It's a collaboration with the reader. The reader also defines it. Gilles Perez once talked about, that who makes the photograph? It's the photographer, it's the subject, the reader, and the camera. There's 4 elements that make the photograph. So all these things are there. And that's an expansive sense of photography, just like representational painting was stuck in representing. Photography then took over pictorialism in the 19th century to imitate painting, but then liberated itself in the 20th century to be different, like I was showing before. And I think the same thing now. We need to liberate photography to be more thoughtful, to be more complex, to be more nuanced, and to get rid of the mythology that it's somehow always giving the answers. It's always true. Nothing is always true. It has some ideas and it has some perceptions, and in a forensic way, it could be incredibly valuable, like as a witness. But there's no absolute truth anywhere. There's a lot of ideas though. So yes, it's like a public intellectual, but it's also more specifically an intelligent photography, as opposed to a kind of reactive photography, F8 and be there. This is much more complicated. It's like, I think it was Eugene Smith, when he taught, he called the course Photography Made Difficult, because if it was easy, why would I teach it? That idea. So it's trying to push it elsewhere. It's a big conversation.
And I'm gonna go slightly quicker now, Fred, because we have quite a few questions coming in, and I want to be able to ask all of the questions to you. But before that, Robert Pluma has dropped in some suggestions or alternatives to subject, and he mentions participant, collaborator, character, person. And just to that, I want to add, in my practice, we've been using collaborator and participant much more commonly now. So when we're working with journalists, in other parts of the world, in different countries, we always refer to, whether it is the photographer, the videographer, the animator, to the person who's done the sound score, we call them all collaborators on our project. So we've all created the project together. And with the hope that by calling them collaborators, we are giving sort of their ideas and their opinions and their feedback equal weight as we would give, had they been present on our team as a full-time staff.
I would add one term to it, which is borrowed from literature, which is protagonist.
I like that. That's really good. Moving on to, I know there are two questions here that are related to synthetic imaging. The first one is from Bianchi Otello, and he asks, do you, Fred, believe that where photography is headed now, synthetic imaging, photoshopping, etc., somewhat undervalues photography as an art by decreasing its authenticity and its essence?
I think it creates a challenge for photography to figure out what it is, just the way photography in 1839 created a challenge for painting to figure out what it is and what it can do differently. So my problem right now, I did a lot of work in the 1980s and 90s about trying to anticipate the impact of software on the photograph, the ease of changing pixels and modifying pixels. Stephen Mays wrote in Time magazine a few years ago that in transiting from a raw file to a TIFF or a JPEG file, something like 2/3 of the pixels are interpolated. They're not actually recordings of the visible light. They're an interpolation of it. So that, that itself is a manipulation already. So I think what I see is the challenge for us to reinvent what we do, to amplify what we do, to become more effective in society, more interesting, more invaluable, and not to be stuck on pretending that it's still the 20th century with the same expectations, the same context. We have to understand that print media is very much on its way out, if not already out, and we have to start thinking of, like, how do you slow people down on a cell phone? How do you use multimedia? How do you make it nonlinear? How do you engage the reader? How do you do it in 27 languages instead of one? We have all these. How do you do hybridized video and photography? How do you use, and Zara will be talking this afternoon, virtual reality, augmented reality, immersive media as well. So that photography has its place, certainly, but it's much more a boutique industry than the mass that it used to be in terms of its witnessing function. Certainly a lot of people make pictures, but I'm not sure, all that many of them resemble what we thought of photography in the 20th century.
So just to get it clear, you do not think that synthetic imaging, photoshopping, all of these new tools and platforms, social media platforms, are actually decreasing the essence of photography. We're just having to expand what we consider photography now to be more innovative and all-encompassing. Is that correct?
I think it's decreasing the witnessing function of the photograph, because you don't know if Obama said that or didn't say that. You don't know if that little boy that I showed exists or doesn't exist. It's creating a problematic for photography. My sense is, there's the content authenticity initiative that wants to use a kind of a blockchain style. I think 200 organizations. It's spearheaded by Adobe, which is ironic considering that Adobe is the same company that brought us Photoshop. How do you then, a reader, should they be able to click and find out if an image has been changed or not? Just the way we preserve currency there. There's different initiatives, different ideas, but this is something we should have been thinking about 30 years ago. Now the environment we're in, maybe we need a frame, like a thick frame that shows this is an actual recording of the visible. This is a special case. And then you click on it, you go to a website, which authenticates it, or you go to the photographer's website, where they talk about their ethics or whatever it would be. But I think that thinking has to come out. Yes, we do have to respond to that challenge. But I think it also presents us the opportunity to do many more things than we did before while responding to that challenge. So that's a long answer to the short question.
And also, I think that disruption is not happening simply in the photographic practice. You're seeing that in text, in written work, in video, in every different form of art. When you take, whether that is like paintings, things like that, it's so easy to now make digital paintings and they look almost like a real, somebody hand painted that. So I think that disruption is happening in every industry and everybody's being forced to think about these things now more.
Yeah, but I could see in 6 months from now, 75 nude pictures of children. And then you ask, well, we're worried about a photograph of a nude child, but here's 75 artificial intelligence images of nude children. How do we deal with that? Do we have to make a separate category for a photograph of an actual person? And how do we represent that to the reader? Just the way you go into a bookstore, nonfiction books and fiction books are in different places. In photography, we don't know which is a nonfiction or fiction photograph. We don't have artificial intelligence, synthetic images, photoshopped images are not required to be labeled differently. Should we require that? How do we enforce it? What do we do about it? And so on. These are massive questions that, there should be enormous think tanks of all the photo agencies, publications sitting around and trying to figure out.
Well, moving on from that to a question that's again related to synthetic imaging is we have Mary Louise Miller who asks you that she's very interested in the overwhelming homogenization of photography and the public perception. It is almost like synthetic photography in how it mimics itself. And she wants to know your thoughts about that.
Well, the interesting thing is synthetic imagery uses data sets of these images, mass, thousands and thousands of images that are available to create their own images that look like photographs. They're not using, for the most part, sophisticated imagery, complex imagery. They're using homogenized imagery. And I think what you're finding a lot is that that's what people gravitate for. It's the first book I wrote in 1990 was called In Our Own Image, The Coming Revolution of Photography. And it was the idea that we wanted to recreate the world in our own image. Synthetic imagery are immortal. They never die. They're permanent. They could do all kinds of things. Synthetic videos, you'll be able to transmogrify into a dinosaur. You'll be able to transmogrify into Spider-Man. You'll be able to do all those things. It's poor photography. You're stuck in your own body. You're stuck in your own self. This is going to be a competition. So yes, you're absolutely right. So I think all of us doing photography, have to think about issues of complexity and nuance and subjectivity and thoughtfulness, as opposed to just, this kind of homogenized image. You're absolutely right. And as Zara said, that's also true of music. There's an awful lot of homogenized music. There's an awful lot of, homogenized text. We now have, artificial
television shows. I mean, you look at television shows, you look at Netflix, like so many of the shows are just based on algorithms, what people like, what they don't. That's the kind of content that's produced.
Yeah, I mean, there's work in Hollywood a number of years ago to attach MRIs. So when they show multiple possible outcomes of a movie, they see which part of your brain is stimulated, and then they know what to choose because it's the pleasure principle, whatever it would be. So yeah, there's a lot of manipulation, a lot of craziness in it. And I think we have to step back from it. And I think we call this the age of image, which is a massive problem, because it's really not, it's the age of destruction of image in many ways. It's, you know, the age of, you know, like you say, homogenizing image. It's almost the age of idolatry. You know, you understand why the graven image, you know, was an issue in the Bible. You understand why, you know, there was a sacredness to it. There was an action, you know, maybe a person would have one photograph of themselves in their lifetime. You know, that happens in a millisecond at this point. So, you know, there's a lot to think about. And you're right.
Yeah, and you know, also just you mentioned the word like image. Also, you know, the younger generation that you speak to, when it is younger millennials, especially Gen Zs, the word image to them also means very different things. When you talk about image, it doesn't necessarily mean a photograph, because the photographs that they are accustomed to seeing are images, are selfies on Instagram and pictures like that. For them, it's mostly videos. That's what they've grown up on. And so, you know, this idea of image, what is an image? And is image too limiting of a term to describe what we consume on a daily basis? I think that's an interesting idea as well.
But it just is, you know, there's the idea of Baudrillard of simulation. And then you simulate, it's like you make a map of the territory and then you don't need the map anymore. So I agree with you, Zara. I think that what they're talking about in image is that there's a new territory, which is the virtual. They don't need the physical anymore. What happens in the virtual is often more important than the physical. I'm not undermining, you know, the physical for young people. Of course, there's a need, but the virtual is often more interesting. More is happening. It's a universe that sometimes membership is better rewarded than being a membership in the physical world, with all its many problems. You know, that it's like Second Life. It's like an escape into a different universe with its own image system, which don't reference the physical world necessarily, but the virtual world.
Absolutely. And like I see my nieces and nephews, they're all between the age of 6 and 15, and they're growing up, and the primary tool they use to communicate is TikTok videos. All they are doing is dancing or making stuff in front of TikTok. That idea of an image or taking photographs or selfies for them is secondary to actually just recording videos of themselves constantly and sending it to their friends, which is just a fascinating way of communicating. Moving on from that, we have one more question about the Four Corners project, Fred, which I do want to get to before we end. If you have any final thoughts, please drop them in the chat. We're 2 minutes before we end, but I do want to get this question in. We have Heather Morton, who asks that, you know, she'd love a further update on your Four Corners project. She uses it as an inspiration for in-class assignment to provide rich context. She also references genius.com, which does this very well for hip hop lyrics. Is there any adoption of Four Corners project more broadly? Alternatively, is there or could there be a standalone website where iconic images could be uploaded and additional context applied through crowdsourced means? And lastly, she asks, what are the potential issues with this crowdsourced idea?
Well, at one point, the World Press Photo, the director said, what if we take all 50 winning images from 50 years and put four corners on them to make context? You know, it depends who controls the context, what you wanted to do with it. I saw it as an authoring tool for the photographer who was there to take more responsibility for the image and be able to, you know, give more depth for any viewer who's interested, as opposed to just turning over images to somebody else to figure out what to use and how to use it. You know, often the captions are either incorrect or short-sighted, incomplete. You know, I've shown this in, I don't know, 150 different lectures. I know there's lots of people using it, but I've had, you know, I've approached various mainstream media, you know, who so far have not used it. I would love, you know, like a Google or somebody like that, you know, to adopt it into their browsers. And, you know, my guess is this will all happen eventually. And I like very much your idea about crowdsourcing images and using that way, and that certainly can be started. You know, you just have to have somebody to moderate it and deal with it, so it doesn't, you know, because sometimes these things could also rebound badly, and people, you know, put in all kinds of incorrect stuff, or, you know, just like something like a Wikipedia, where people could be very, very useful, but you do need, to moderate so it stays within some kind of a boundary of actually what happened, with different interpretations. So all these things are possible to do there. No, it's just, just in conclusion, it's just in a wide open field. And I think the mistake is waiting for people from above with more power to do it. I think we all have to do it, in our different ways. And what Zara and I are going to be trying to show you in the next few days is different, approaches, the idea being it's all open source. It's all, anybody can do it, try it. And, the best way to get it adopted is to build models, and then, other people will borrow it, will copy it, which is a great compliment and very useful.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Zara, so much for this introductory talk. This was illuminating, and we look forward to having Zara speak this afternoon in a couple hours, 2 p.m. New York time.
And 7 British Summer Time. Thank you so much, Fred and Zara. That was incredible. What
That
an
was,
amazing start. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to the audience for the questions too. This was really brilliant. So we'll see you in a couple hours. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.